Imagine a leader daring his adversary to meet him face-to-face on live television. That happened this week when Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky publicly called out Vladimir Putin's ceasefire proposal as nothing but theater. You're about to see how strategic misdirection, high-stakes diplomacy, and fractured alliances shaped a dramatic diplomatic standoff in Turkey. On the evening of May 11th, President Vladimir Putin addressed the Russian nation. He framed it as a genuine olive branch, offering ceasefire negotiations with Ukraine in Turkey. In reality, it was a calculated play. Russia's military continued daily attacks on Ukrainian cities with ballistic missiles and drones, undermining any pretense of peace. Behind the scenes, that speech aimed to stall a major European Union sanctions package the diplomats had threatened to impose if Russia did not agree to a 30-day ceasefire. Putin's gambit served two audiences: European capitals and former U.S. President Donald Trump. In Brussels, divisions over further sanctions, especially resistance from Hungary, made unanimous action elusive. Moscow counted on that disunity to buy time. At the same time, Kremlin strategists anticipated Trump's social media reaction. They knew his previous calls for direct talks could be used to weaken Western resolve. Sure enough, within hours, Trump's Truth Social account lit up. He declared Russia's proposal a possibility worth testing. He urged Ukraine to agree immediately to talks in Turkey and warned that only then could the world know where everything stands. Trump framed it as a chance for clarity, but ignored Ukraine's stipulation: no talks without an unconditional ceasefire first. Ukraine's President Zelensky refused to be boxed in. On May 12th, he took the debate public. He named Ankara as the venue. He agreed to meet on Thursday, May 15, precisely the date Putin suggested. He even invited Trump to join, highlighting Moscow's bad faith. It was a masterstroke of transparency. By openly calling Putin's bluff, Zelensky framed Russia as the only party blocking talks. That public challenge forced Putin into retreat. Within 24 hours, Kremlin spokesman dismissed the proposal as propaganda. No meeting, no in-person talks. Putin instead invited Zelensky to meet deputies at dinner, undermining his own call for direct negotiations. The world saw the play acting: a dictator unwilling to face his foe, and a president ready to hold him accountable. Behind the headlines, the EU machinery continued to churn. On May 13th, European leaders adopted a 17th sanctions package, targeting Russia's shadow fleet, human rights violators, and chemical weapons networks, but shelved tougher measures on energy and finance until U.S. backing is secured. Brussels warned that further delays would erode credibility and embolden Moscow. As this unfolds, you'll see how each move on the chessboard reveals deeper fractures: authoritarian theatrics, populist rhetoric, and alliance politics. Within hours of Putin's May 11th proposal, Ukrainian forces and civilians saw no halt in attacks. Ballistic missiles and drones continued to rain down across eastern cities. On May 12th, President Zelensky delivered a statement acknowledging those ongoing strikes and noting that Moscow had offered no genuine reply to his peace overture. That clip wasn't polished TV theater. It was raw confirmation that Russia's ceasefire talk was a propaganda ploy. Hours later, a second video showed Zelensky detailing the meeting terms. Ankara, May 15th, only with Putin himself present. He even signaled flexibility. If Putin insisted on Istanbul, Ukraine's leadership, alongside Turkey's President Erdogan, would relocate there to keep the date. By naming the exact city and bringing Erdogan into the frame, Zelensky forced the Kremlin to either honor its word or be publicly dismantled. Predictably, Moscow's spin machines went into overdrive. Kremlin spokespeople dismissed the entire proposal as propaganda, offering only to send lower-level envoys for dinner discussions rather than a face-to-face summit between the two presidents. In a single news cycle, the world saw the architect of the Ukraine war refuse direct dialogue with its chief victim, undermining Putin's own narrative of seeking peace. Meanwhile, Western capitals scrambled to translate that theater into policy. On May 13th, the European Union pushed through its 17th sanctions package against Russia. This round targeted elements of the shadow oil fleet, human rights offenders, and hybrid warfare networks. Yet tougher measures on gas, nuclear assets, and finance were shelved pending U.S. alignment, highlighting the alliance's political tightrope. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz warned that if Putin remained unyielding this week, Brussels would tighten the sanction screws even further, especially on energy exports, where Russia still finds buyers. Across the channel, French President Emmanuel Macron echoed that stance, insisting a credible ceasefire ultimatum hinges on unified, severe penalties for continued aggression. Behind closed doors in Brussels and Washington, diplomats were finalizing a joint proposal for a 30-day unconditional ceasefire to accompany any talks, putting Ukraine's demand for peace before negotiations, not after. That alignment, born of Zelensky's public challenge, is unprecedented. Europe's largest capitals and the U.S. administration setting the same preconditions, directly countering Moscow's script. But fissures remain. Hungary's veto threat loomed over energy sanctions, And across the Atlantic, former President Trump's call for immediate talks, shared within days of Putin's speech, had already diluted Western unity, giving Russia precious breathing room. When Zelensky invited Trump to Turkey, it was partly to highlight that division. If an erstwhile U.S. leader could urge talks without a ceasefire, why could not the sitting president stand firm? All of these moves unfolded in less than 48 hours. Footage of Zelensky's direct address aired alongside Putin's dismissive press clips, creating a visual narrative in which one leader stood firm and the other hid behind aides. Public perception shifted. Ukraine looked ready to talk peace. Russia looked afraid to face the consequences. European capitals moved swiftly after Putin walked back his own proposal by advancing the EU's 17th sanctions package. That new round penalized around 200 shadow fleet tankers supporting Russian oil smuggling and slapped restrictions on 30 firms trading dual-use goods. 75 individuals tied to the military industry joined a human rights blacklist aimed at judges who presided over cases of dissidents like Kara-Murza and the late Navalny. The package also enabled future measures against entities targeting critical subsea cables and planned an eventual ban on missile-related chemicals. Paris and Berlin signaled that the pressure must deepen. France's foreign minister called on EU partners and Washington to suffocate Russia's economy completely, urging follow-up measures on energy, finance, and industrial supply chains. Germany's chancellor warned that without tangible progress toward ending the war this week, Brussels stands ready to unleash even tougher sanctions on oil, gas, and key financial services. In Brussels, diplomats drafted a transatlantic framework demanding a 30-day unconditional land, air, and sea ceasefire as the precondition for any talks in Turkey, a direct inversion of Moscow's own script. Back in Kiev, the president's chief of staff argued that Putin's absence at the proposed Istanbul summit should itself trigger new U.S. measures. He reminded American lawmakers that only sustained economic and diplomatic pressure compels the Kremlin to budge. That appeal resonated on Capitol Hill, where calls grew to magnify tariffs, expand asset freezes, and target Russian oligarchs beyond the existing blacklist. But the unity forged by Zelensky's public challenge faces tests on both sides of the Atlantic. In Washington, former President Biden accused his successor of modern-day appeasement, warning a rush to talks without preconditions would undermine U.S. credibility in Europe. Those comments highlighted anxiety that divided American politics could weaken the joint stance as Republicans push for a negotiated peace that Russia exploits. Inside Russia, the Kremlin accused European leaders of making contradictory and confrontational statements and dismissed sanctions talk as posturing. From Moscow state media to official spokesmen, the message was that EU unity was fragile and that any delay in energy measures would fracture the bloc's resolve. EU foreign policy leadership countered that these public threats only underscore how much leverage sanctions retain when applied decisively. On the ground in Ukraine, the impact of the 17th package is already felt. Shadow fleet tankers have rerouted to avoid sanctions, driving up shipping costs and delaying fuel supplies. Russian firms trading dual-use goods face licensing hurdles that slow military production. Human rights sanctions against judges send a warning signal to the judicial system that domestic repression carries an international price. Meanwhile, U.S. lawmakers debate a bill calling for 500% tariffs on Russian oil imports, a step that would aim both to punish Moscow and to protect American industry. Those discussions underscore the role of domestic politics in shaping foreign policy outcomes. If enacted, the tariffs would add another layer of economic pressure that European leaders have long sought but struggled to secure unanimously. As Zelensky's face-off forced Putin's bluff into the open, alliances rallied around a tougher sanctions regime. Yet political crosswinds in Russia, Europe, and the United States threaten to erode that momentum. Here's how the squeeze on Moscow's coffers is altering the fight on the ground, and why that shift matters for Ukraine's bid to secure any lasting ceasefire. First, Europe's successive sanction rounds are forcing Russia into costly workarounds that directly hit its frontline operations. Oil revenues, the lifeblood of Moscow's war budget, have plummeted since the EU and G7 targeted its shadow fleet, driving tanker rates sky high and squeezing Kremlin coffers. Director Torbjorn Becker warned EU ministers that Russia has already dipped into its sovereign wealth fund down to less than 3% of GDP, with the fund projected to run dry within a year if oil prices stay depressed. Without cheap fuel, Russian units face delayed resupplies of ammunition, food, and and winter gear. Ukrainian commanders report longer wait times for artillery shells and fuel convoys, delays measured not in hours but in days, that blunt Moscow's ability to press offensives in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia. Second, sanctions on dual-use goods are choking Russian defense production. The EU's 17th package hit 30 companies trading critical components used in drones, guidance systems, and night vision gear. Firms now face complex licensing hurdles, and Western suppliers have halted exports outright. Translation on the battlefield: fewer precision strike drones in Russian arsenals, and more reliance on indiscriminate bombing with unguided munitions. Human rights blacklists against judges and oligarchs add political pressure within the security apparatus, discouraging the free flow of procurement funds into the war machine. Third, the looming threat of even tougher measures is reshaping decision-making in Moscow. France's foreign minister urged partners to suffocate Russia's economy completely, backing U.S. proposals for 500% tariffs on Russian oil imports. That prospect has rattled Kremlin insiders. In private meetings, regional governors have begun lobbying against deepening isolation, warning that civilian morale and their own political survival depends on stable energy and food supplies. If those warnings leak, it could amplify popular discontent in a society already grappling with inflation north of 20% and disruptions in everyday goods. Meanwhile, the public narrative in Russia is fracturing. State media has shifted from boasting about battlefield victories to defensive attacks on Western idiots plotting Russia's demise. Presidential speeches now include thinly veiled appeals for national unity against external sanctions aggression, betraying Kremlin anxiety over domestic blowback. Analysts believe any pause in hostilities, even temporary, could embolden critics within the security services who argue that endless war without gains weakens Putin's grip. On the Ukrainian side, Kyiv's leadership is already leveraging these fault lines. By insisting on an unconditional ceasefire before talks, Zelensky has tied Moscow's hands. Any failure to agree on a 30-day halt will spotlight Russia's unwillingness to de-escalate, just as its economy teeters. Brussels diplomats confirm that this framework, a ceasefire as a precondition, not an afterthought, owes its unity to Zelensky's public challenge. If sanctions continue to bite and battlefield supply delays worsen, Putin faces a brutal choice: accept a ceasefire under duress, or double down on repression at home. Will that framework hold momentum? It depends on two factors. First, Western resolve. If the U.S. Senate approves hefty oil tariffs and Europe follows through on planned energy bans, Russia's war machine may be forced into at least a temporary halt to regroup. Second, internal Kremlin dynamics. If hardliners in Moscow prevail, branding any ceasefire as weakness, the conflict could grind on despite economic agony. But if pragmatic voices exploit the sanctions-induced chaos to press for an exit, Zelensky's gamble may pay off with tangible relief for frontline units. That's the real story behind the headlines. Sanctions are no longer abstract policy tools. They're active players in the battlefield calculus. As Russia's economy strains and its political center trembles, the lines between diplomatic theater and military reality blur. Thank you for watching. If you found the video helpful, then like and subscribe. See you on the next one. Peace.